If you bring a room of investors together and ask them, hey, do you think AI is a platform shift? About 9 out of 10 will raise their hands. If you ask them, hey, can you define what a platform shift is? Like, you will not see as many hands. And the answers will not really be consistent. So you start with, hey, what on earth is a platform shift anyway? What does that mean? How does this fit in? And therefore, how does this then impact existing platforms? You need sort of 4 components. You need an underlying product, a way to build applications for that product. You need to then match the users of your product with with those applications. And then you need an economic benefit for those developers. Without those 4 components, you do not have a platform. Now, if you look at AI and LLMs, like none of that is happening. Yes, a lot of people use ChatGPT, but nobody's building applications on top of ChatGPT. People do not access or use applications through ChatGPT. This is a new technological capability for sure. Potentially has society-altering consequences, but you are not seeing a platform shift here. You can argue there's a technology shift. The way you build products does not actually change. Fundamentally, it is the same thing. What you have is a new piece of your tech stack. And so what sort of novel experiences can you build with this new piece of your tech stack? I think that's the fundamental question you need to ask. The wrong rabbit hole to go down is, hey, and everything is kind of going to happen through a chat interface. And I think over and over, we've discovered that the chat interface is pretty high friction.
Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Boundaryless Conversations podcast. In this podcast, we explore the future of business models, organizations, markets, and society in our rapidly changing world. I'm joined today by my usual co-host, Shruti Prakash. Hello, Shruti.
Hello, everybody.
We also have a special guest today that shares the passion for platforms and ecosystems, and it's a little bit of a legend in space. It's Samir Singh. Samir is a long-time writer and explorer of platforms, ecosystems, marketplaces, network effects, and he writes on his blog Breadcrumbs.vc, which many of you, I'm sure, know. And he is also a partner at the Speed Invest, where he looks into marketplace and especially network effects enabled organizations. And we'll talk about this more in the future minutes. And he's also an instructor at Reforge, where he teaches a course about network effects. So glad to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Simone and Shruti. Glad to be here.
You have been into this world since more than 10 years now. And in the last, I think it's more or less 5 years, you're doing investing.
Correct. Yeah. Since 2021.
So I would be curious to hear how your perception of the market of this industry, let's say, or the sector in the industry has changed over time, and especially what you have seen in terms of changes and impacts in your role as an investor, right? So maybe that's a good starting point.
I'd say network effects are kind of always hard to find. And one thing I've consistently seen is that people always mistake what a network effect is. And it happens in sort of every technological era. It happened in mobile apps. It happened once people sort of ran out of marketplaces and started labeling things like scooter companies and 10-minute grocery companies, marketplaces. It's happening in the current AI era. The biggest change is sort of the frame of reference through which the mistakes happen, as opposed to the mistakes. So the core fundamental constructs of network effects are basically built on math. They don't really change. They're fundamentally always the same. And the number of companies that have them will always like a small minority. The only recent change I'm seeing is that as sort of the volume of dollars available has sort of grown, it increases sort of the noise in the ecosystem. So it's even harder to separate signal from noise and kind of find the right companies, or the companies that kind of have that glimmer of a network effect at their core.
The noise is broader, right? So do you make more mistakes, or maybe you are just more attentive, separating the signal from the noise?
I mean, good question. I mean, in this job, you always make mistakes. In fact, you make more mistakes than get them right. Mm-hmm. But at least the nature of mistakes tends to vary, right? If you make the same mistake consistently, then something is fundamentally wrong. And so the things that I try to not make mistakes on are the fundamentals. Like, is there a seed of a network effect in this product? So is there a unique structured multiplayer interaction at its heart? I think that bit is more of a science. That part's kind of easier to get right. Now, how much of a problem does that interaction solve. That's sort of halfway between science and art. Like there is definitely scope to make mistakes there. And then there is how committed is the founder to seeing out and truly solving that problem. There's even more scope for mistakes there. And so that's kind of how you would look at it. The science part of it, you should not make mistakes. The art part of it, you kind of underwrite some mistakes happening.
So it looks like there is maybe a broader scope of application of these principles in the last few years, and with this broader set of application spaces, it's easier to find maybe non-optimal teams or non-optimal opportunities. So pick the real ones that really have the scalable network effects. It's a bit of a challenge. It's becoming a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, and also sort of it's useful to remember that for consumer startups in particular, which is sort of my neck of the woods, generally you don't find a massive correlation between things like founder background and sort of eventual outcomes. Whereas that correlation tends to be a bit stronger, let's say, deep tech startups and biotech startups and maybe even SaaS startups. Like not really that's not my area. But in this world, you don't. So you're often looking at first-time founders. And the learning curve for them is pretty steep. And so trying to separate the folks that have the slope, so to speak, are on the right trajectory, really understand this problem at a very, very deep level, have a certain missionary zeal to solve it, are not just mercenaries. I think that's where some of the art sits.
Especially focusing on consumer tech and consumer companies, what is changing? Because it looks like the market is changing a lot. It's definitely a market where there are lots of alternatives now. It's overwhelmed with options. The major categories are being captured already. Distribution is becoming extremely more competitive. Social habits are changing rapidly. AI, of course, we're talking about AI more deeply, but AI is impacting the type of interactions we have in the consumer space. What are the 2 or 3 things that you are excited about these days when you look for companies?
The 2 main things that seem interesting right now. The first is, products that sort of leverage technology changes are always interesting. So are there multiplayer interactions that can be built today now that AI exists that could not be built a couple of years ago? Like that's an interesting area. I made one investment this year off the back of that thesis, not announced yet, but essentially think of it as a game, a multiplayer game that could not exist without AI, mobile multiplayer game, built off of image models. So that's sort of one interesting area. Then there's a couple of other sort of areas I'm looking there in sort of productivity enhancement and stuff like that. The second interesting area is just sort of behavioral shifts in new generations. If you look at, let's say, Gen Z is a very overused term, so I kind of grimace when I say it. But if you look at Gen Z and compare them to folks that are sort of 10 or 20 years earlier, they are more willing to share stuff about themselves with their friends than those folks are. Stuff like sharing your calendar with your friends, your location with your friends, your dating life with your friends, even shared payments. There's a whole lot to unpack there that didn't really exist a while ago. So while I think quote unquote a social network as a construct has been played out, it's been done. There's probably not a whole lot of scope there, but there is scope for building out something at the intersection of, let's say, social and utility or social and productivity. And we're seeing some interesting players there.
When you spoke about behavioral shift in, let's say, the Gen Z, how does that sort of adapt in traditional systems or systems that are many a times built by incumbent companies or traditional, let's say, B2B sort of perspectives, which might not be accommodative of, newer mindsets and shifts?
That's the beauty of a consumer product, right? When you build a consumer product to solve a particular pain point, you're going straight to the user. The user tends to adopt these products and spread these products with their social circles. And that bottom-up organic user growth is kind of what we're looking for. And so it tends to circumvent existing system beyond sort of distribution. If you're following traditional distribution channels, then yes, that's a bit of a problem. And sometimes, you do need to leverage them for parts of your acquisition flow. But the higher your K factor is, the higher your word of mouth coefficient is, the less you need to rely on traditional modes of distribution. Now, that is the holy grail. Like, if you can get to a K factor of 1.1, like, that's exceedingly rare, doesn't really happen that often. But there are companies that have gotten sort of halfway there, close to that. And that does go a long way towards minimizing the impact of sort of saturated paid marketing channels and stuff like that.
Sort of the language around it when it comes to a platform shift or a not platform shift that's sort of happening. What does all of this mean in an ecosystem design? I think we'll be curious about it from our side. Yeah, how does this impact existing platforms? Is it sort of spawning in new platforms? How does that look when AI is integrated?
So if you bring a room of investors together and ask them, hey, do you think AI is a platform shift? About 9 out of 10 will raise their hands. If you ask them, hey, can you define what a platform shift is? Like, you will not see as many hands. And the answers will not really be consistent. So you start with, hey, what on earth is a platform shift anyway? What does that mean? How does this fit in? And therefore, how does this then impact existing platforms? So the way I've defined most platforms is you need sort of 4 components. You need an underlying product, a product that someone uses. You need a way to build applications for that product. You need to then match the users of your product with with those applications. And then you need an economic benefit for those developers. Without those 4 components, you do not have a platform. And in this case, I'm using a platform in sort of a very, very specific way. In academia, platform is a broader term. To me, platform is a much narrower term. And so if you're looking at a category level platform shift, the underlying product has to be a product category that people use, let's say browsers or smartphones. And then you have developers building on top of those browsers or smartphones. So developers who are building websites or developers who are building mobile apps. And then sort of the rest of it kind of followed from that. So the more users you had of browsers and smartphones, the more valuable it was for developers to build on those sort of platform categories. And the more websites and mobile apps they were, the more useful browsers and smartphones became to end users. So that is what created a new platform shift. Essentially, you had a new platform on which to build on. And there's a network effect between both those sides. Now, if you look at AI and LLMs, like, none of that is happening. Yes, a lot of people use ChatGPT, but nobody's building applications on top of ChatGPT. People do not access or use applications through ChatGPT. That does not happen. This is a new technological capability for sure, and it potentially has, society-altering consequences. But you are not seeing a platform shift here. You can argue there's a technology shift. So essentially what it is, there's a new technological capability which you can bake into existing products. So let's say your Salesforce, right? You are quite a sprawling bit of software right now. Can you create more automations to be able to pre-populate a lot of these fields that need to be filled by end users? So that's sort of one way sort of AI can sort of remove bits of friction from existing bits of software. And that can happen across lots of different types of products. So in that sense, there's definitely a lot of benefit that incumbents gain from this. Now, the question is, if you are creating a new company, what do you do? Creating a new company is very, very easy when there is a new platform shift because, hey, nobody's built on browsers yet. So you can go build something on a browser. You can go build a mobile app. It's an entirely new interaction paradigm. And so the products look and feel different. The form factor is different. Like, none of that is happening right now. And so the question you kind of need to ask yourself is, okay, the way you build products does not actually change. Fundamentally, it is the same thing. What you have is a new piece of your tech stack. And so what sort of novel experiences can you build with this new piece of your tech stack? I think that's the fundamental question you need to ask. The wrong rabbit hole to go down is, hey, and everything is kind of going to happen through a chat interface. And I think over and over, we've discovered that the chat interface is pretty high friction. And so it is a great replacement for things that already require very high cognitive load activities. I need to go talk to someone. I need to send emails back and forth with someone. I need to go do a lot of research. I think chat replaces that very, very effectively. What it does not do is replace clicks effectively. And it should not. Clicks or tabs. try not to do that, and instead, within the existing paradigm of building products with GUI, what can you do with this tech stack? And if you're an incumbent, what bits of your user interface have the most friction, and what can you remove with this tech stack?
Do you see today that, let's say, startups or founders are currently at least overbuilding, thinking it's a platform shift that's sort of happening? And is that sort of avoidable? How have you seen it sort of take shape?
Oh, absolutely. I can give you a couple of examples, right? So one of the areas that we see a lot of hype about is agentic commerce. Like the idea that people are going to be making transactions with AI. And so increasingly, a lot of the pitches we see are, hey, here's a way to book flights or book hotels with an LLM. As you know, you kind of search for, show me flights from San Francisco to London. And then it'll ask you, hey, kind of, do you have time preferences? I was like, yeah, I want it to be from this time to that time. Do you have a date preference? I was like, yes, from this time to that time. In case you haven't put all that in the initial prompt already. Do you prefer a particular carrier? And then it'll kind of, once you kind of go through all of that, it will give you a link at the end. You can click through it and go book it. And effectively, all it's done is replace search filters on a GUI with a chat message. And that is just sort of increased. All it's done is add friction to the user interface. Like that doesn't really accomplish anything. And then you have to kind of remember that these systems are probabilistic. I mean, there's a lot of research going on into reinforcement learning to kind of work out if you can make them deterministic. At least as of now, I don't see any line of sight to making them deterministic. And without that happening, automated commerce is not very realistic. And all you have left with is this sort of super high friction chat interface. And so instead, you kind of be thinking about, okay, if you do have a chat interface, how is that different from a ChatGPT or a Gemini? What can you not accomplish there? And two, what use cases is it suited for? Where, an alternative mode would actually have very, very high cognitive load. And if you don't have something like that, essentially you got to work out, okay, what problem are you solving? What sort of quote unquote product, the GUI based interface would go solve that? And then what pieces of this tech stack, of this new tech stack, can you leverage to get you there faster to create a great experience? It's obviously a lot easier once you dive into specifics and talk about specific products, and then it becomes easier to kind of unpack what makes sense, what doesn't make sense.
When you say you cannot really build applications on top of on ChatGPT, right? How is that true? So there's a lot of people building applications on top of this technology. Maybe what I can see is that they are building these applications on top of this technology as a commodity, as a ubiquitous technology.
So I'll put it this way, right? The differences between, let's say, using an application on an iPhone versus using iOS SDKs to build on any sort of web-based product. The idea of a platform shift is that the underlying product has ownership of the customers, of the users. So let's say people are using ChatGPT as a product, not just GPT-4 or GPT-5, the technology. I'm talking about ChatGPT, the product. And they are not using applications through ChatGPT. Developers are not building applications for ChatGPT users. What they are doing is creating a third-party application that you can go access it via the web or the App Store, and that product's got sort of GPT-5 embedded in it. GPT-5 or Gemini 2.5 or Claude Sonnet or whatever it might be.
No, that's a good point, because to some extent I'm thinking that that's where the current product strategy of the various LLM providers is failing, because what is the point? Context is extremely important in the interaction with LLMs, right? And so far, there is no real portable context across applications. So for example, if I use 3 applications that are powered by ChatGPT APIs, but they do not use my context as a user, which is into the ChatGPT OpenAI platform. So basically, they are using a white label.
They're using the API.
Yeah, they're using the API, so a blank state ChatGPT agent. While maybe the value would be that if I can bring my context. So maybe imagine that if I log through an OpenAI account into a service that uses OpenAI platform, I can bring my context, and that would be building products on ChatGPT according to your thesis, more or less, right?
I mean, there is a hypothesis, but when you kind of look at usage behavior, it's kind of hard to make that argument sometimes. So I'll give you an example, right? So there was a report from OpenAI which basically kind of broke down how ChatGPT is used. And I'd say the biggest chunk of, let's say, ChatGPT usage is kind of asking for information, searching for information. Essentially, things that are not really possible via Google, or it'd be sort of too high friction to go do that. And so you're trying to get a quick summary of information. Now, is that necessarily going to be very, very useful for an application that is generating images? Probably not. And so the challenge is like the use cases can be so fragmented. Like I'm not sure how much portability of context would actually help. Maybe for some applications it would, and for some applications it won't. But I'm not. Sometimes people think it's a bit of a home run, and I'm not so sure that it is in fact a home run. And so this is where I come back to the idea of it is not just context. It is the fact that the product, the end product, like the iPhone, like Chrome, essentially owns the end user. And the access of the application is happening through that product. If you do not have that, it is very, very hard to make any argument for any sort of network effect, platform dynamics that actually end up happening. Without that, it's basically hope.
I mean, they tried with plugins, right?
I mean, it did work, right? And one of the reasons they didn't work is like let's just say discovery of applications is kind of hard with the chat interface. Now they're trying again with MCPs. We'll kind of see how that goes. Like, frankly, I don't see it being dramatically different.
I mean, NCP is completely different, by the way. So I think plugins are really what more or less you were talking about in terms of
initially I was
having an app distribution.
I mean, yeah. I mean, the reason I mentioned MCP is because right now they're trying to automatically route to sort of different MCPs, and the whole idea is developers are sort of building MCPs on the side. But again, there's a lot of nuances in application and sort of problems there that sort of break the discovery flow, which really is central to any sort of platform dynamic.
But I think we unearthed a little interesting point here that I see this friction with, you said, for example, it's a real platform shift if the experience goes through the product. But at the same time, the fact that OpenAI is and other players are trying to make this happen. So they want people to interact with their interface. They're not creating portable context, which is, at the end of the day, probably one of the enabling bricks of building products on top of AI. So there is this tension between that I want to create portable context because this is going to enable experiencing their intelligence on other websites, but at the same time, it's paradoxically the real piece that may somewhat let them become an enabling real platform, right, where you actually own part of the user experience. Because if I think about the context I gave to my AIs, it's a lot of context. And I can see that, of course, I see your point in use case fragmentation, but I see that it could be useful in few applications.
I mean, potentially. I mean, that's certainly, you might say, one building block, as you mentioned. But I think the bigger roadblock is just the fact that you have a chat interface. And we know that the chat interface is inherently limiting. Like, until you kind of solve that roadblock, I'm not sure the other building blocks matter as much. Like, I mean, the biggest reason sort of plugins sort of failed is because in that interface, discovery is hard. So how do you get people to even know that they can use plugin X, Y, or Z?
There's a lot of talking about SEO for LLMs. I'm wondering, what do you see happening in terms of the potential for LLMs to actually become at least distribution channels?
There is certainly some traffic being generated via LLMs. I think we've seen it across some of our portfolio companies as well. A lot of companies are noticing it. So as an emerging channel, it certainly makes sense to optimize for it. I mean, we saw this with TikTok a while ago, where a certain amount of search was happening on TikTok, and you would try and optimize by building certain kind of videos to ensure that once certain search terms were sort of included in the search box, that your videos would show up and not others. There is definitely room for that. Then again, when you actually dive into the data that at least I've seen, the share of traffic from LLMs, while it's growing very, very fast, is still very, very small. Like we're talking low single digits percentage. And so that would have to be meaningfully into the double digits before it genuinely moves the needle or anything. And at least so far, like there might be sort of a handful of products here and there where that's happening, but at least across the board, I'm not seeing that happening yet. I'm not saying that can't happen. Like if that does happen, look, then certainly the value of AEO goes up exponentially. But at least so far, it's still a small share of traffic. So I'd say it makes sense to optimize as much as you can, but it probably should not be an outsized share of your efforts.
And you don't see the possibility for advertising models to enter the picture. So
they could. You kind of have to work out what the right format would be. I think, which is non-trivial. I think people are sort of understating how challenging that can be. But I think that's an inevitability because, if you look at the economics of LLMs, you will have to gain some advertising share to make these economically viable. Like it's not an option. Now, what that does to LLM marketing optimization, we don't know because it depends on what the format is. We don't know what the format is. The AEO in my mind is different. It's not organically trying to get the LLM to mention your product versus another.
yeah, it's like SEO versus blue links.
Yeah.
Advertising links. Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually going to say from my company itself, I could see that around, I think, 10% of all of my, let's say, inquiries today come from like LLM searches. So that I found interesting. So I was curious maybe if this is a very industry specific challenge or difference or whatever. So maybe it could be that.
It could be. There's definitely some variation. I've seen a couple of instances where that has been true. And so if you are, then definitely you should sort of put more effort into AEO.
Yeah, potentially niche industries is my, let's say, assumption in terms of what could be, sort of leading in that direction. Actually, I wanted to, sort of touch upon this, and one of the points that you brought in earlier, one was that maybe all of this is getting more views, but potentially the action is limited. That is, let's say people clicking on a certain action is limited. So even though accessibility to information has increased drastically, maybe the intent, action, things like that has not changed very highly from a consumer, let's say, perspective. There is a lot of creation, generation, all of that's happening, but retention is obviously low. Quality of the content, let's say, being produced is very low. So how do you tackle that? Should we create frictions or create constraints? How does all of this sort of take place, and how do you improve your quality of how you work with AI?
Are you talking about an LLM or you're talking about an application developer that's using sort of AI as part of their tech stack?
I'm just talking about LLMs, yeah, for now.
At least when I was talking about it, I was talking about more from an application standpoint that's using AI as part of this tech stack. From an organization's point of view, if you actually look at the behavioral data of ChatGPT, about 2/3 of writing requests or content generation requests for via AI are for editing existing text as opposed to generating net new text. And I think that's in general a much stronger use case for it. AI struggles with creativity. Essentially what it's doing is sort of predicting the next word, right? And so there's a baseline level of quality it'll have, but the ceiling of it is also quite limited. So if you do have something meaningful that you as a human have written or generated and using AI to edit it, that's probably a much stronger use case of it. And the best developers I've spoken to kind of use AI the same way in a coding context, in the sense of they don't necessarily let it run wild. They kind of give it snippets of text to kind of edit and improve and fix, as opposed to if you kind of wipe code an entire product and trying to figure out where it's broken is much harder.
You seem to be a bit skeptical, no, on this AI frenzy.
On the frenzy, yes.
Yeah, because my question was really about the structural benefits that you see, because you've been critical about the distribution capabilities. You've been critical about the UI impacts, UX impacts. So what are you instead, what do you think is going to have an impact, especially on consumer and network effects based businesses in your perspective? So in the investees that you have invested in recently, what were the usage of, especially Gen AI. I'm really curious because that's the radical shift now.
When you have a construct where a user is interacting with the AI, you have very, let's say, non-existent opportunity to create network effects. At the end of the day, a network effect is a unique, structured, multiplayer interaction between users. When you have that, you can create a network effect around it. When a user is interacting with AI, by definition, that is a single player interaction. The AI is not a person. It is not a user. It is software. The only way to enable that unique structured multiplayer interaction is to work out, okay, what kind of interaction can you create between two or more users with sort of AI under the hood? And this is where sort of lots of novel experimentation is taking place. And again, keeping in mind that AI is probabilistic, there are use cases in entertainment, gaming, where having AI generated constructs is an interesting basis of an interaction. I've got two portfolio companies that I unfortunately can't talk about in detail. One is at the intersection of AI shopping and gaming, and the other one's at the intersection of AI social and game. And they're both enabled by Gen AI under the hood in very different ways. One of them sort of uses image models. The other one essentially uses AI-enabled scoring of submissions and AI judges. If you took AI away from both products would not exist. So that to me is a more interesting application of AI, where you're kind of staying away from the frenzy, because when you're interacting with AI, it is a magical experience, and sometimes people expect it to be a lot more than it is. Whereas when you kind of treat it like a novel piece of your tech stack, and you just sort of think about, okay, what problems and experiences can you create now that you have this piece of your tech stack, you're generally far more free to open an experiment and come up with multiplayer interactions that make sense.
Something like, for example, I don't know, music generation. It has a social, inherently social graph, fans versus creators, and it's enabled by AI. So something where AI is enabling maybe a new generation of creators to connect with their fans or something like that.
I mean, that's more what I've called AI 1.5. Which is basically the way that works is user A comes in, generates AI, creates AI generated content of some shape or form. In this case, that's music, and that gets shared with other users. It's viable, and you're seeing some products that do that. The problem you run into is that in general, there's not many, you might say, limitations on creation. So a lot of people go in and sort of create something, and you have a very, very high volume of often low quality content.
So you lose that scarcity element that makes it borrowable on the first stance.
I mean, you not only do you lose scarcity, you also lose interest, because there's so much of it, and most of it is kind of blah, right? And so that affects retention on the consumer side as well. And so usually for products like this, I'm fairly insistent on having a good degree of creative friction on the creator side. So yes, you can generate stuff with AI, but don't make it sort of one-click generation. That sort of one-click or one-sentence generation sort of defeats the purpose of creation, where it's not that satisfying for the creator, it's not that satisfying for the consumer. You need the creator to actually put some work into it. And you've got sort of this tool that can help him along that journey, but don't make it too easy. Once you kind of add that creative friction in, then sort of becomes more of a multiplayer interaction, which is why I always say the AI is part of your tech stack. Like, strip it out of your user interface as much as possible. The more you have it in your user interface, the more tempting it is to have one-click generation, users interacting with AI directly, which sort of breaks every form of network effect you can have.
So you're looking into something that is more like creating an entirely new type of interaction, or like have a 10x impact on the type of interaction, where you say, for example, Gen AI driven gaming, your creation of words, or having non-human characters that can interact in the system, making it much more attractive for the gamers to join, or something like that.
I'm not even going that far, right? So think about Minecraft, let's say. In Minecraft, you have a ton of combinations of products that are essentially man-made, right? So you just sort of combine this and this, and you get this. There are probabilistic creations you could take. So the one example I take, just as a very simple example, this is not multiplayer, is a game called infinite craft. Portfolio company of mine showed this to me, and literally it's a very, very simple game. You open up the game and there's like 4 elements on the screen. If I remember correctly, it's water, fire, earth, and something. And so as you combine sort of 2 of the elements on the screen, sort of there's a new AI generated element that pops up. That again you can combine with any of the elements. You basically have infinite combinations, right? So that construct is certainly an AI generated construct that could be under the surface of a game, right? And that's sort of one example that I'm using. There's probably multiple ways to implement this logic. And so again, if you have a way to combine things in infinite ways, because the output is always probabilistic, what can you create? What sort of multiplayer interaction can you create there? I'm not a founder, not a creative, but other founders are. And so when you point them in this direction, that the minds go wild and they kind of start experimenting with stuff. And so that's what I'm encouraging people to do, kind of to stop thinking of this as a product. AI is not a product. It is a part, probably a critical part of your technology stack that you can use in very creative ways, at least from the point of view of a consumer product. It's kind of hard to see AI as product be a paradigm 5 years from now, from my vantage point.
I mean, I think your point is extremely clear and interesting, no? Because one of the points that we have raised in a completely different scope, imagine organizations, right? So we what we say these days is that as labor and time become less of a measure of value in organizations, organizations are prompted to think through what is the value that they want to create in market, or in society more in general, right? So similarly, your point is, okay, AI is not creating value for the user per se. You have first to think about value and then think about how AI can maybe make it possible to create value in a much faster way or much more diverse way, or enabling your creative thinking cross gaps that before generative AI would have costed you a lot of money, because you would have needed a human actually to do some of the steps that connected the two users in the systems.
Correct. And the very basic example I use is someone's invented a hammer. Stop going and handing everyone a hammer and give people tables and chairs instead.
If you look at the companies you're looking into for investing, network effects, these new avenues of value that you have identified, behavioral changes, what are the characteristics, some of the common threads that you see in these companies that entrepreneurs should be maybe thinking about or looking into?
I'll start with a caveat that this is probably more specific to, again, consumer startups. That's sort of the area I invest in. To start with the founders, missionaries, not mercenaries, is a pretty safe rule, which is the founder has some sort of irrational obsession with this problem. It sort of borders on illogical, at least sort of to the average observer, right? And so that is super important to have. Without that, it's very hard to keep working on the same problem for like 7-10 years. Like eventually you will give up. Like, this is not easy stuff, right? Second, the founders have to be numerate. They don't have to be data scientists, but they need to be able to think through numbers. Like, when you're selling to an organization or a business, you can go ask them what their problems are. When you have even 10,000 active users, you can't ask people what their problems are, because their problems are not necessarily consistent. And so first, you got to start with behavior. What are you seeing in behavior? What positives and negatives are you seeing in behavior? Are you seeing drop-offs in a particular page on your onboarding screen? Are you seeing a drop in retention after a certain period? Are you seeing lower activation rates among a certain cohort? And then you kind of dive deeper, and eventually you kind of narrow down a small enough cohort of users that you can talk to. And so you kind of have to be numerate by definition. And you have to be very, very, very open to feedback. One of the challenges of building consumer products are consumers are notoriously fickle. The problem you thought of might have been valid, but your initial solution might not be. And so you're going to need to iterate until you get there. And you have to be very open to seeing what the market is, what users are telling you through their behavior. So that's on the user side. On the product side, so if you're building a marketplace, ensuring that you're not doing direct sales on both sides is insanely important. that's a big failure pattern. You need to ensure that you can have scalable acquisition on one side, which basically means one side of your marketplace behaves like a consumer. Either they kind of search for you online and they find you, or when you onboard one side, they invite the other side in, or you kind of operate some sort of a SaaS-enabled marketplace where you initially just start selling just to one side of the marketplace, and then you have loads of them using the product. Then you can sort of figure out how to onboard the other side. But trying to do direct sales on both sides is a bit of a problem. And so when you kind of look for sort of those three factors in general, that really winnows down the number of marketplaces that actually exist. And that's part of the reason why marketplaces are such hard businesses relative to like B2B SaaS, where you can direct sell to one side and be just fine, right? If you're building a consumer network, these are sort of even more sciencey than I think the average marketplace, at least, where you have to be even more data driven, and you kind of have to work out what your route to liquidity is, because there are far more paths to liquidity here. The easiest one, if you're building a friend network, is, hey, you sign up a user, they invite their friends, boom, you're done, right? So at least they've got 2 or 3 users using this together all at the same time. Slack used that model. Facebook, less so Facebook, maybe WhatsApp used that model. Snapchat used that model, sort of pretty popular. The other sort of network you have is sort of a discovery-based network, where users sort of show up to not use it with their friends, but kind of find other things or people. And this is where things are infinitely harder, because you have to have liquidity first before you onboard users. So what you kind of have to do is create some sort of tool that users are willing to share the output of in some way, shape, or form. So as an example, Instagram, like the first use case was creating filters, right? And those filtered pictures got shared on Facebook. And they kind of had a bit of an Instagram logo, which brought users to Instagram. And so that A is a bit of a single player use case, but also B, population distribution. So it's called piggybacking. YouTube also did something very similar. People don't really see the parallels between Instagram and YouTube, but it happened. YouTube, the earliest users were, at least, once they found success with, was musicians that had MySpace pages. They had to find a way to embed their music videos on their MySpace pages, and that ended up being a YouTube embed, which sort of populated YouTube in the early days. So those are networks. The implementation is always much harder and very, very specific to each network, but it's always the same structure, so to speak. But that's also why you find so few of them. So you will always find more ones that sort of rely on friend invitations versus others. So those are sort of the distribution paradigm. And then finally, behavior. Often you kind of come across founders that say, hey, retention is not great now, it's going to get better later. That never really happens. Usually retention is a function of the core problem the product solves. If it's not a big enough problem, you're not going to have retention. If it's a big enough problem, you will have retention, right? Especially if you're going after the right kind of users. The important thing to keep in mind is kind of how you measure retention. Retention, you can measure it daily, you can measure it weekly, you can measure it monthly. Like, there's no right frequency. There is only a right frequency for your product. Like, for example, if you measure daily retention for Airbnb, it'll probably be terrible. It's not meant to be used daily. It's meant to be used 3 times a year. And so you got to figure out, okay, how frequently is this product meant to be used, and then kind of create a retention measure around that makes sense.
From what you say, the focus on retention, the obsession, almost illogical obsession with the topic. Sometimes it's hard to understand if you're really solving a problem of the customer. So I think it tells us about a consumer market which is somewhat saturated, and you really need to be digging deep to understand where the value is in consumer at the moment, right? What are the pockets of value that are still there in consumer? Maybe before we move into the breadcrumbs, you can add, I don't know, 2 or 3 spaces where you see, you mentioned gaming, social interactions in general, which, before you mentioned, social finance or social utility, anything that you want to say a bit more specifically about what pockets of industries are being interesting at the moment?
I mean, to be honest, if I had the answer to that question, I would be a founder. The fun part of my job is I don't need to have an answer to that question. But I will say, like, consumer always looks saturated until someone finds a problem that is interesting. I've never, historically, if you look across the last 10, 15 years, it's always seemed like consumer is either saturated or the new thing is just a toy, right? So really what you're trying to figure out is what is the next thing that looks like a toy that might not be one.
Right. I mean, maybe I'm biased because I remember when I started my career in platforms and ecosystems, it was the age of the sharing economy, right? So everybody was doing Uber for X, and that seemed more easy, no, to find.
And now people say it's cursor for X.
Cursor for X, yes.
There's something slightly different when they're sort of easier to build, but there's like 20 competitors to the same thing.
AI assisted building or creation, right?
Yeah, and sort of with Uber for X, the problem was it was very hard to get liquidity for a lot of these super local marketplaces. And so a lot of those things wouldn't get off the ground. Now the problem is a lot of these things do get off the ground, but there's like 20 others of the same thing. How do you stand out and how do you differentiate in the market? So you're sort of always going to go back and forth between these things.
And this brings to the internet theory, right? So much content that nobody cares about and is made by agents, and that's it.
One of the points that Simone was speaking about earlier as well, I think for me interesting is how participative, I guess, consumers are. I think that's something that stands out for me in this sort of, let's say, era, let's call it. So I'm curious how that amount of vast user data, quick feedback loops, things like that can make a company's, let's say, product or offering stronger. So that's something I'm interested to see.
I mean, that's definitely true. You consistently see the companies that make the most progress, irrespective of all other factors being the same, tend to be ones that learn from data the fastest. Two different examples of companies, one that sort of is doing well, one that did not do well, is where they were experimenting with some landing pages and one company kind of figured out that, hey, something in the landing page wasn't working. Within a week, they had a new one, they had some early data and it would be working and it was sort of up and running and swapped out. And the other one took about 4 weeks to hire an agency to redo the landing page. So it was faster iteration cycles based on data will always take you much further.
Firstly, thank you. Thanks, Amir. I think we had some, really interesting opinions and thoughts shared, which are rather different from the industry. So we always appreciate that. So towards the end of the podcast, we have this section called as the Breadcrumbs, where, you could share maybe some podcasts, books, anything that you take inspiration from that our listeners can also, sort of look into.
I'm more of a book person than a podcast person. So I'll start with a book recommendation. I think the book Technology Revolutions and Financial Capital by Carlota Perez probably is one of the most consequential ones for the current era we're living through. Like if you want to understand AI, and this book was written like 25 years ago, it's probably one of the best reads you can. Now the caveat is like the book is kind of written like a textbook. So it's not necessarily the most engaging read, but it's a very important one. So I'll always give that caveat for this book. So that's one. If you want to understand how startups work, or rather sort of what makes interesting startups, this book called Pattern Breakers by Mike Maples, who's a Floodgate founder, is a very interesting one. He sort of breaks down a lot of the key elements, especially for folks that are not up to speed with this world. Is probably a very, very informative read. And a blog, or rather a set of blogs that I will refer to as, everyone should read Bill Gurley's blog. He wrote many of these posts 15, 20 years ago. All revenue is not created equal is an important one again for the current era. It's funny how many old books and blog posts are applicable right now. Whenever we're in cycles, I always refer back to old books. There are universal truths that you can always rely on, and you just need to work out what they are from first principles. And some of these books kind of help you understand what those first principles are. And so that I always tend to recommend.
First of all, thank you so much. I mean, it's been very dense. I think a few ideas we discussed are really, really important and generative. I don't want to make the list, but I think I need to re-listen to the podcast, and our listeners probably will have to do the same. So thank you for your time. I hope you also enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, always fun. Talking about network effects is not work to me.
For our listeners, of course, you will find on our website all the details, the notes, all the books that Samir has suggested, some other pieces that maybe resonate with the conversation we had today. So go to www.boundless.io/resources/podcast. You will see the podcast there. And of course, until we speak again, remember to think boundaryless.